Chapter 3 of Ester Ried's Namesake. Ester Ried's Namesake by Pansy. Chapter 3 Thorns. "Why, my dear," he said, "I thought it would be Mary that you would want. I have thought about it a good deal, and wondered if there was any way to plan it." "Mary?" She repeated the name in astonishment. Men were certainly bewildering. "Why, Spencer, I wouldn't have Mary leave mother for the world; and there is no need for her to come. In fact, mother simply could not live without her; but Sarah is different. It is for mother's and Mary's sake, not mine, that I want Sarah to come; chiefly, I mean. Father used to have a great deal of influence over poor Sarah. We noticed that she was much better able to control her nerves when he was at home; but she always found it hard to be patient with Mary, she is so many years the younger, you know, and poor Sarah could never seem to realize that she was anything but a little girl to be directed and governed. Now that father is gone, I can think just what friction there is. Oh, Spencer, it is hard to put into words, but don't you understand?" "I begin to," said the missionary, with a sympathetic smile, "although I find it difficult to think of friction in connection with your sister Mary." But it was slowly dawning upon him that his wife wanted her sister Sarah to come out to them, for the sake of the mother and sister in the East, and that she did not want to put such a statement baldly, even to him. The suggestion appalled him at first. It was true, as he had told his wife, that he had been thinking about a visit from Mary, but he had got no farther than an earnest wish that the way might somehow be opened for her to come to them for a little while. To boldly undertake to plan a way for any of them looked much like attempting the impossible. But determined people, especially if they are also self-sacrificing people, often succeed in accomplishing the almost impossible. In the course of time, at the expense of certain comforts, and indeed almost necessities, about which the friends in the East would never hear, the eldest sister, Sarah, came out to them, ostensibly for a visit, though even then the missionary and his wife looked steadily at the thought that they might never be able to plan for her return. Not so the guest. She came as one who had condescended, and told certain of the neighbors in the early weeks of her visit that she presumed she would not stay long. She had been sorry for her sister's loneliness, and so had consented to the long and tedious journey; but she had always hated the West, and been vexed with her sister for allowing her husband to bury himself there. With regard to money matters, Aunt Sarah was as ignorant as a child. She only knew that in the years of her girlhood whatever she wanted could be had for the asking, and if she went downtown without sufficient money in her purse, she had only to mention her father's name to find merchants and milliners delighted to accommodate her. During the brief, stormy period of her married life, her needs, so far as understood, had been supplied from the same source as when she was a girl, and the girl widow had gone back to her childhood home expecting to be taken care of as she had always been. When the financial crash came that swept away her father's fortune, she understood the reasons for it less than the average girl of 12 would have done, and was sure of but one thing, that somebody was to blame for all the discomforts that rolled in upon her. "They ought to be ashamed of themselves," was the indignant phrase often on her lips, the "they" being that vague, impersonal force that illogical people are always blaming or expecting to perform. In this case the use of it was so unreasonable as to leave no room for argument. It even called a wan smile to the haggard face of the much younger, much wiser sister Mary, who knew that she was now her mother's and oldest sister's main dependence. When that hearty invitation came for Sarah to go West for a visit of indefinite length, accompanied by a check sufficient to meet her traveling expenses, only Mary knew the magnitude of the burden thus suddenly lifted from her shoulders. The girl had been true to the last pledge she had made to her father, and shielded her mother even from the knowledge of friction as much as possible. Aunt Sarah had been willing, even eager, to make the journey. Anything being better, she told her younger sister bitterly, than to live as beggars among the people who had known them all their lives as superiors. "If we have got to live a life of slow starvation, It is much better to do it where we are not known and among people who couldn't appreciate any other style of living. If Spencer had been half a man, he would have sent for you and mother at the same time." To her personal friends she explained that "poor Helen" needed her, she had been buried alive out there so many years that she felt as though she must have one of them with her, and of course she was the one to sacrifice her own interests and go. If the missionary and his wife had fallen unconsciously into the habit of always saying "poor Sarah," they were only returning the phrase that had been employed for them. The oldest sister had persistently said "poor Helen" ever since the girl had married a home missionary instead of the young man with brilliant prospects who had struggled bravely to win her to a different decision. She had been loud in her criticism of both her father and mother in permitting such a sacrifice, and she talked volubly of the privations to which she must accustom herself in going out to share "poor Helen's" home. Yet it is certain that she had understood little about them. The first sight of the homely frame house, set in the midst of what seemed to her a vast sandy desert, struck something like terror to her soul. Nor were the scant furnishings and the general air of what she called shabbiness that characterized the living rooms calculated to reassure her. There had, of course, been no attempt to deceive her; but the letters home since the father's death had been reticent and cheerful from principle. Besides, they were so busy with their work, and so happy in it, that many of what the undisciplined guests named trials and privations had touched them lightly, or been overlooked altogether. Still they had been careful to let the coming guest know to a penny the income on which the home missionary had to depend, believing that people who could reason would have no difficulty in reaching their own conclusions. But Aunt Sarah had never reasoned. She remembered vividly that father seemed to be always sending a box or a package or a check to Helen, yet she could not be made to understand what a difference the cessation of these gifts had made in the missionary's home. During the earlier months of her visit her questions were often like instruments of torture. Conversations not unlike the following were frequent. "Helen, what has become of that elegant carpet father sent you? I remember telling him that it was very foolish to buy a Wilton velvet carpet to send away out here, but he said he wanted one that would do for your grandchildren." "Why, that was burned in our big fire. Don't you remember my writing all about it, how Spencer burnt his hands trying to save that carpet and some other things?" "That dreadful fire! Think of your splendid piano going with the rest, and those elegant curtains, far too elegant for the room. I said so at the time. Father was really ridiculous in his ideas about some things. And now they are all gone. It does seem as though they could have saved something that was worth saving if they had really tried." That impersonal "they," yet it hurt Helen Randall. She felt sure that no more heroic effort had ever been made than her husband, and the few friends who were near enough to reach them in time, had made to save their home. And they had saved many things, the minister's precious books in goodly numbers. Of course no carpets or curtains could compete with these. But Aunt Sarah did not so understand it. In the same breath with which she sighed and said, "It does seem as though they could have saved a few things if they had tried," she added in tones significant, "rows and rows of great dull books lugged out, and your piano and lovely chairs that father sent you, and the curtains and portieres all left here to burn. Isn't that just like men?" But the most bewildering problem in the missionary home was the daughter, Ester. Aunt Sarah had lived a life that was singularly out of touch with childhood or young girlhood. There had been no child of her own to soften and sweeten her nature, and she seemed to have forgotten that she herself was ever a child, or at least she had forgotten what manner of child she was. As for Ester, she was by no means a perfect child, and she undoubtedly rasped the nerves of her Aunt Sarah in 1,000 ways that she did not understand, as well as in some that she did. From the very first there had been a sort of antagonism between the two. "Why don't you make that child's dresses longer?" was the first note of criticism. "She looks like a fright with her bobbed off skirts and her long lank legs." Then, before the mother could make her gentle explanation, Ester's gray eyes would flash, and her tone would express words unsaid as she answered, "My mother likes my dresses this way best, and she knows." "Oh, she does, sauce box! Who asked you anything about it? What a wild looking creature you are! I should think you would be afraid of being mistaken for a squaw, with your straight hair dangling about your face, and your skin as brown as a butternut. If you would wear your sunbonnet when you raced around the country like a colt, you wouldn't be quite so black, at least." All this was as gall and wormwood to Ester, who hated her straight hair and her tawny skin fully as much as she did her too short dresses. Not for the world would she have told Aunt Sarah that her dresses were short because she had outgrown them, and that she was trying to be a brave girl and wear them and other things without complaint so as not to worry father. If she could have made a confidant of her aunt and accepted her as one of them, it would doubtless have been better for both. But with the unerring instinct of childhood, the girl had understood that her aunt had no real interest in her, and no sympathy with her childish plans and endeavors. Nor had the friction between them thus early exhibited lessened as the years passed. The young girl made, in spasms at least, what she considered superhuman efforts at self-control. But there were times when she believed it impossible to keep back the keen sarcasms that flashed through her mind as naturally as a fire of kindlings burns when a match is set to it. At 13, the chief relic of her childhood was a great doll of rare mechanism and beauty that had been the gift of her grandfather in his most prosperous days, and that was a rock of offense to her Aunt Sarah. "A great girl like you lugging a doll around!" she would sneer, as Ester, with her treasure in her arms, was caught trying to make her escape to a certain tree with wide-spreading branches that she considered her hiding place. "I wonder what your cousin Lucia would say if she could see you. She is a whole year younger than you, and she packed away her dolls long ago." "Grandfather sent me this doll," would Ester reply, throwing all the fierceness into her tones that she longed to put into words and knew that she must not. "Well, what if he did? He sent you a silver rattle once. Why don't you go shaking that through the house because it was a present from your grandfather? For that matter, about everything you have came from him. But if he were alive, I can assure you he wouldn't feel flattered to hear of your going about with a doll in your arms, a girl almost as tall as her mother." Scenes like these often repeated kept the young girl's blood at the boiling point, and it is easy to guess what would have happened had there not always been the gentle mother to speak softly, with a tender hand laid on the child's arm. "Never mind, dear, Aunt Sarah isn't used to children, remember. Slip away with your doll and enjoy her." Sometimes Ester wondered, with a kind of terror, just what she would do if mother were not there. But since she was, the quick-tempered child generally managed to keep within the limits of a muttered, "I wonder what she is used to," as she sped away. But there were times when her indignation burst all bounds, and then would occur one of those scenes which invariably afterward caused a deep descent into the valley of humiliation. It was after her doll-playing days were really over that the girl's severest tests came. Aunt Sarah, who besides having no sympathy with young people, had no practical knowledge as to their training, chose to accuse poor Ester of being too fond of her boy classmates in the public school. "I am sure I don't understand what your mother can be thinking about," she would begin the moment Ester appeared in sight. "You are forever with the boys. I don't believe you have any girl friends." "Oh, indeed I have, Aunt Sarah, hosts of them." "Then why in the name of decency are you never seen with them? I have watched you coming home, morning and afternoon, for 3 days in succession, and there has been a boy on each side of you every time, and not a girl in sight." "Oh, you don't mean that, Aunt Sarah, because you said you watched me, and I am a girl, you know. But I can explain the reason for that horrible state of things. Dreadful as it may be, it is a fact that not a single girl in our grade lives down this way. I have to part from them all at the corner, and there are 2 of those disreputable creatures known as boys who happen to live one on the first corner below us and the other a few steps farther, and instead of having the decency to wait until I get home, or at the very least to cross the road and walk home on the other side, they will persist in coming right along with me. It is terrible, but it makes everything plain, doesn't it?" "Now, Miss Malapert," would Aunt Sarah respond, "you are fairly started, aren't you? Of course you can find something to be saucy about. I never knew such a girl. Not the least thing can I say without having a piece of your tongue. I suppose you think you are smart, but if you would like my opinion in plain English, I think you are the most disagreeable girl I ever met. I should think you would be ashamed of yourself, talking to your own aunt in that way, just because she wants you to grow up a modest, respectable girl, instead of a hoyden who is always running after the boys." Chapter 4 Recording by Trisha G.